The kidneys. So the kidneys filter waste products out of the blood and reabsorb useful solutes like glucose. So here is a picture or a diagram of the kidneys. So the artery that supplies the kidneys with oxygenated blood is called the renal artery, and the veins which take deoxygenated blood away from the kidneys is called the renal vein. And then looking at the structure of the kidney, this bit here is called the cortex, and the yellow bit here is called the medulla. And then we've got two tubes which take the urine to the bladder, which are called the ureter, and then the bit where the urine is excreted is called the urethra. So, looking at excretion of waste products. So one of the main functions of the kidneys is to excrete waste products like urea produced by the liver. They also regulate the water potential of the blood. So, the kidneys are the organs of excretion. So, blood enters the kidney through the renal artery and then passes through capillaries in the cortex of the kidney. As the blood passes through the capillaries, substances are filtered out of the blood into long tubules that surround the capillaries, and this process is called ultrafiltration. And useful substances like glucose are reabsorbed back into the blood from the tubules in the medulla and the cortex, and this is known as selective reabsorption. And then the remaining unwanted substances like urea pass along the tubules, then along the ureter to the bladder where they're expelled as urine. And the filtered blood passes out of the kidneys through the renal vein. So if we just look at the structure of a kidney nephron, you'll notice here, this is the coming from the renal artery, and you've got two ends of the capillary bed. You've got the afferent end and the efferent end. And you can see that the diameter of these capillaries gets thinner as you go from the afferent towards the efferent end. So this capillary bed is known as a glomerulus. And then the start of the kidney nephron that has the filtrate in is called the Bowman's capsule, and that surrounds the glomerulus. And then you've got the first part of the tubule is known as the proximal convoluted tubule. Then this big loop here is called the loop of Henle. Then you've got the distal convoluted tubule. And finally, you've got the collecting duct. And then you can see that the capillaries goes from the artery, renal artery end, and then here it's returning back to the renal vein. And all this part here is in the cortex, and all this part here is in the medulla. So the first thing that happens in this part here, is where blood is filtered at the start of the nephrons. So the long tubules plus the bundle of capillaries where the blood is filtered are called nephrons. So this is one nephron. But there are about 1 million nephrons in each kidney. So blood from the renal artery enters the small arterioles in the cortex. And each arteriole splits into glomerulus, which is a bundle of capillaries looped inside a hollow ball-like structure called the Bowman's capsule. And that is where ultrafiltration takes place. The arteriole that takes blood into each glomerulus is called the afferent arteriole, and the arteriole that takes blood, the filtered blood, away from the glomerulus is called the efferent arteriole. And you can see from this diagram that the efferent arteriole is a lot smaller in diameter than the afferent arteriole. So the blood that is in the glomerulus is under high pressure. And the high pressure forces liquid and small molecules in the blood out of the capillary into the Bowman's capsule. So the liquid and small molecules pass through 3 layers in the Bowman's capsule, from the capillary to the Bowman's capsule. So you've got the endothelial layer, which has little gaps between the endothelial cells. You've got the basement membrane, and then you've got the epithelial cells of the Bowman's capsule. So the liquid and small molecules pass through 3 layers to get into the Bowman's capsule and enter the tubule, the nephron tube. They pass through the capillary wall, which is the endothelial layer. Then they go through the basement membrane, and then they go through the gaps between the epithelial cells of the Bowman's capsule. So larger molecules like proteins and blood cells can't pass through and they stay in the blood. But the liquid and the small molecules, which are now called the filtrate, pass along the rest of the nephron, and useful substances are reabsorbed along the way. So all this orange bit here is part of the kidney tubule, and it contains the filtrate. And then finally, the filtrate flows through the collecting duct and passes out of the kidney along the ureter. So useful substances are reabsorbed as it moves along the nephron tubules, and this is known as selective reabsorption. And this selective reabsorption takes place as the filtrate flows through the proximal convoluted tubule and the loop of Henle and the distal convoluted tubule. And useful substances leave the tubules of the nephrons and enter the capillary network that is wrapped around them. The epithelium of the wall of the proximal convoluted tubule has microvilli to provide a large surface area for the reabsorption of useful materials from the filtrate in the tubules into the blood in the capillaries. And useful solutes like glucose, amino acids, vitamins, and some salts are reabsorbed along the proximal convoluted tubule by active transport and facilitated diffusion. Some urea is also reabsorbed by diffusion, but most of it will go out through the urine. So you can see here are the microvilli on the epithelial cells of the proximal convoluted tubule, which increase the surface area, and some things will be reabsorbed either by active transport or facilitated diffusion. And also water enters the blood by osmosis because the water potential of the blood is lower than that of the filtrate. So water is reabsorbed from the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. And the filtrate that remains is the urine, which then passes along the ureter to the bladder. So urine is usually made up of water and dissolved salts, urea, other substances such as hormones and excess vitamins. But urine doesn't usually contain proteins and blood cells because they're too big to be filtered out of the blood. It doesn't usually contain glucose, amino acids and vitamins because they are actively reabsorbed back into the blood. So that's the beginning of the kidney structure. In the next lesson, I'll go through how we can regulate our water potential in our blood using the ADH hormone.